and welcome everybody. So in this webinar, we're going to look at Azure services, see what's available, how I can create some of them, and so on. Now, we've only got less than an hour, so there's no way that we could touch on all of them. But there is a lot of commonality. There's the look and feel when you're creating these various services is fairly constant across. I mean, certainly there are differences, of course, and we'll look at some of those differences, etc. But there is the commonality that makes it much easier to figure out, well, I know how to create this service now. How do I create another service? So we'll look at them. Within the services, Azure breaks them down by categories. And again, this is just a sampling of categories. This is probably the most popular ones. You have things like integration services. Integration services would be where you get into things like, Internet of Things or event hubs or anything that is, as its name suggests, trying to obtain data from one source and provide it to something else. Compute, that's where we get into probably the most common one in the compute resource is a virtual machine. So we'll look at, I'll do a bit of a demo creating a virtual machine as well, and we'll focus on them because the virtual machines tend to be the most common, the things that people get introduced to first. But we also have like databases. There are, if you're into databases, there's a couple of different ways that we can do these. We can do the databases as IaaS solutions where you create a virtual machine in Azure and then you install SQL Server on it in a pretty much exactly the same way you would in an on-premises environment. But there are also PaaS versions of databases built in. So SQL Server, there is a PaaS version of that you can use, so you don't have the underlying virtual machine and operating system, etc., to look after. IoT itself, there's a number of features for IoT. Networking, there's an entire infrastructure built into Azure to allow you to create, whether you're creating IaaS solutions, so you have virtual machines, etc., that are all running, supporting some sort of line of business app, or you just have, or you have some PaaS apps like web services or something along those lines, databases, etc. They need to be able to talk to one another, so you do have that infrastructure available. We have storage. You can use storage as part of an overall solution that's built in to the cloud, or initially storage was used quite extensively for backups and things like that, and it's still used for that today, but it's been expanded quite a bit since those early days. We've got analytics, right? You've probably all come across like big data and analyzing data that comes in to see what we can do with it, etc. What information we can extract from the data. There's a very large amount of analytics built into Azure. The web stuff, this is where you get into things like web apps. So you can have applications written, and there's quite a few different languages that it supports for the web apps as well. So depending on background, and then machine learning. So machine learning, this is where you can get into, creating bots and responding to questions in an intelligent, have the system respond in an intelligent way to systems or questions, I should say. I'm sorry. So, now to actually create these, there's a number of different ways of creating the various services, etc. We do have the portal. The portal is the GUI access point. And you can do most things, well, you can do pretty well all things in the portal. And then we have PowerShell, we have JSON, and we have CLI. Now, a lot of these things cross over because within the portal, I can, if I have a JSON file, for example, I bring the JSON file into the portal and then I can deploy it from there. The same thing with PowerShell and CLI. I do have the option built into the portal is a Cloud Shell. And if I click on the little Cloud Shell icon, a little part at the bottom of the screen opens up, and I can select whether I want to use PowerShell or CLI, but it's still part of the portal. One of the nice things about it, though, like I don't have to do that. I can, from my workstation, open up PowerShell or CLI, depending on what my preference is, and do the same thing. One of the differences, though, is when I open the Cloud Shell, it will take along with it the credentials that I'm using as part of my existing session. So then I don't have to worry about, well, logging on again and re-authenticating all that. It takes it with it, so it makes it a little bit simpler. But we'll look at each one. So the first then is the portal. If you haven't seen, I suspect most have seen the portal. Here's what the portal looks like. And if I wanted to create something, I could just go to something like virtual machines. And right now, I don't have any in here, so I got the add button up in the left-hand corner. Or I could use the create virtual machine button down here, whichever I prefer. Okay, so subscription, what subscription do you want? What resource group? So I'll create a new one. Oops. I got a demo one here already. Now, notice that it's got the asterisks here, which is fairly standard. This is showing you this is something that's needed. And although you can't see it very well, there's a little eye here inside this circle. And as you can see, I got that pop-up. So if I'm not 100% sure about what it is that it wants me to put into this particular box, I could just hover over it. So this is the virtual machine name, and it tells us that in Azure, we do have two distinct names. A virtual machine name is used as a resource identifier and the guest host name. So when we create the VM, okay, we use it uses the same name for both. Okay. And it cannot be changed after you create it. So you have to make sure that you create the right one. So I'm just going to call this my VM, really fancy. What region? It does default to East US, but whatever region is most appropriate for you. Generally, we want to, when we're deploying any of these resources, we want to deploy them as close to the end user as possible. Okay. Availability, we won't really get into this too much here, but we can create things called availability sets or availability zones, depending. Not all regions support availability zones, but the basic idea here is we can set it up so that we can have multiple identical machines running simultaneously. And the idea being is it will load balance across them. So we can also specify things like auto scaling, for example. So I can specify if the machines get up to, let's say, 75% CPU capacity across, as an average across all of the machines, it will add another machine or two machines, depending on how I configure it, right? For this, I'm not going to add any of those. Image, it does default to Ubuntu. You can change it, let's say, I don't know, Windows 2019 Data Center, okay? And you'll notice that down here, this changes. So if I put this back to Ubuntu, it will change the type of server that's down here, the amount of memory, and so on. Well, yeah, let's just go to Windows, okay? Or if I don't like that, I can select the size, right? So if I want something different, okay, and it just lists all of the various virtual machines that or SKUs that are available at this level. So I'll leave that. Now at this point, so this is, it's got to start. I do have to provide the password, and then I'll have to confirm it. But just for a demo, I'm going to leave this blank. I'm going to pretend I forgot or something, but I didn't do this, just to show you in a couple of minutes when we get to the end what happens when you make a mistake or miss something. Okay. Inbound ports, you could have none, or you could have selected ones. In this case, all I want is RDP, which is port 3389. I don't have to do it here. I can add this later, but it's convenient to be able to add it here. Okay. So that's the basics blade. Now I go on to disks. For the operating system type, it will default to premium SSD, but I can go to a standard SSD or a hard drive. It's generally recommended you leave it at the premium SSD for production machines. If I'm setting something up for, like a proof of concept or something like that, I'll go to a hard disk. But other than that, not a big deal. Okay. And depending on the SKU, this is where you would add. Like if this was, for example, I was setting up a SQL box, I would add additional disks in here for data and log files and things like that. For this example, all I really need is the operating system disk. For networking, what it'll do is it will default to creating a new virtual network for me, and it will give a name to it. If that's what I want, not a problem. I can just I can leave it. Or if I have other virtual networks that I want to use, I could select it. The same thing with the subnet. It will give me a default subnet. It will pick one for me. Again, if I'm okay with that, not a problem. I just leave it alone, and that's fine. Otherwise, I can change it if I wish. Okay, public IP address, it'll give me a public one. I'm not worrying about too much about the security groups at this point, so I'm allowing selected ports, the 3389 we saw earlier. Okay. Then in the management, we can get into things, do I want boot diagnostics? Okay. Guest diagnostics, the storage account. Whenever we have any of this diagnostic stuff, of course, it's going to be collecting data. The question then is, where do you put it, right? So it does have to have a place to put it. In this case, it'll create a storage account for me and then store the data as it collects it in that storage account. So we have system assigned, managed identity is off. We can have Azure can look after the identities for various resources. Sometimes we need either a virtual machine or sometimes it's an application to be able to reach out and access some resource. Well, in order to access a resource, you have to have credentials and permissions to do so, and it can look after that for you. The Azure Active Directory, this one's, well, as you can see, it's preview. They're working on expanding some of the Azure Active Directory features. Auto shutdown, we typically don't use auto shutdown, but it does come in handy in some situations. Like, for example, if I was this is a virtual machine I was setting up for, let's say, we have some developers in-house, and they need these servers to do their development work. But they work, 9 to 5. Well, what I can do, like if they're only working 9 to 5, they don't need these servers at night. So one of the options that I can do is I can specify auto shutdown to shut down these servers at some predetermined time. If they're finished at 5, maybe I'll target 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. The advantage of that is when the virtual machine is shut down, you don't get charged for any compute resources because it's not consuming any. There's still some storage associated with the virtual hard disks and those kinds of things, but the actual compute resources go away because you're not using them, right? And you know, if the developers aren't using these machines at night, then why would I want to pay for compute resources that I'm really not using? Now, of course, this, you can see the default is off. That doesn't really make sense in a production environment. Most production machines do run, you know, 24/7. But, you know, it is possible you could have in a production environment something um, that is part-time, and you could use the auto shutdown. We could also specify backup. And again, we do have the little I here. So if at any point you're going through here and it's sort of like, well, I'm not 100% sure what this thing is, you can um, you can use the I for an explanation. Okay, and then we have advanced. This is where we can get into. We can have extensions on this. Like sometimes we have perhaps a script or something along those lines to show us what we or to set something up on the virtual machine when it starts. Okay, so I can certainly do that. That's not a problem. Okay, in this case, I'm going to keep it fairly simple. I'll just and then we have tags. Tags in and of themselves really don't do anything. They're kind of like metadata. You know, like you see tags on web pages, etc. They're there to give us some information about it. Maybe I need to keep track of, you know, what department has what virtual machine, etc. I could put tags in there for that. For our purposes, I'm not going to. So instead, I'm just going to go to the review and create. Okay. Now, the first thing it does is it does a validation. And you'll notice that the validation failed. Okay. There's something wrong with it. Now, instead of just sort of leaving us hanging and saying, yeah, okay, fine, you start doing some internet searches to find out why validation would fail on a particular configuration of a virtual machine in Azure. If you notice, we have all of the blade tabs here, and you notice the basic one has a little red dot by it. That red dot means that whatever this is, whatever this failure is on that blade. Okay, so now I don't have to go searching for it. I just click on basics, and well, so far everything looks good. And I come down here, and sure enough. So I'll just put this in. Okay. Oops. There. And you notice I get the little check mark. When I get the check mark, then it means that whatever I put in here is okay. So now I got to do the same thing here. And I got the check mark again. Now, I can go back through the individual blades again if I want to, but I don't have to. I can go back here and it will immediately go into the validation, and you can see the validation passed. Okay, so I did have a problem in that I left the password off. I fixed that, and now everything is okay. So I could click create, and it will create the thing. Okay, I won't worry about that at this point. So we can also do the same thing in PowerShell. So if you prefer to create and to work in PowerShell, here's an example. So new AZVM. By the way, they're changing. If you've been exposed to some of the PowerShell stuff for Azure, we used to have. Well, I suppose we still do, but the newer abbreviate or the newer prefix is just AZ. It used to be Azure, and then it was Azure RM, so now it's going to the AZ. So resource group name, whatever the name of your resource group is, the name of the VM, so I called mine my VM, this is the same thing. The location, so what region is it in? This is the same region that I used. Virtual network name, whatever it is, subnet name, security group name, public IP address, and then open ports. And this has the same open port. Oh no, I only had 3389, but I could have selected 80 as well. Now, one of the things I should mention at this point is you notice that we do have things like subnets. Okay, that makes sense. I need a subnet, right? But I'm not specifying here what the subnet is. What it does is I'm giving it the name for the subnet. If I didn't, it would just call the subnet default. But it's providing the actual subnet itself. So similar to like in the portal, I didn't specify what I wanted for a subnet. I just, okay, here you have at it. And it provided one for me. This does it's not as obvious here. You can see that I am providing the subnet name. I'm just not providing the subnet. So it provides some of that stuff in the background. We can also do the same thing with CLI code. So if you've got more of a Linux background or a Unix background, and you prefer the Bash style of an interface rather than the PowerShell, we have that as well. So here it's AZ. We've got a create verb in here, and then the noun is just, well, what is it that you want to create? In this case, it's a virtual machine. We got a resource group, the name, again, my VM. What is the image? So 2016 data center. I think I did the 2019 data center, but whatever it was. The admin username, okay, whatever. And then to open the ports, so here we have the AZVM, we're doing something, open port, the port 80, the resource group, and the name of the virtual machine. Okay, so these two are functionally identical. Well, except for this one has port 3389 as well and a public IP address. But you can switch back and forth. And as a matter of fact, when you go into the portal, see, so here's back to the portal. Here's the Cloud Shell that I was talking about. And you notice it just opens it at the bottom of the screen. It'll connect, and it'll take whatever it is that you used last. So whatever I was doing the last time I was in here, I was using PowerShell, right? And if that's what I want, not a problem. I can leave it alone, okay? Or I can change to Bash if I wish. Okay, and it gives me the Bash shell. Okay, so it makes it much easier. We also have ARM templates. Now, ARM simply stands for Azure Resource Manager, and basically the Resource Manager in Azure is it's not new, but it's a relatively new addition into Azure. We didn't used to have, but it's been there for a few years. But basically, it provides an environment in which you can create, maintain, deploy, and maintain your various resources. Okay, so it provides the tools that you need, etc. The resource groups, the logical grouping, the security that's associated with them, etc. So that's where the resource manager comes from. Now, for the JSON, if you haven't seen it before, here's this is just an example on Microsoft's site, right? So the ARM template, it can be a little bit scary when you first get into it, but it's actually fairly straightforward. We start with an open bracket, specify the schema. The schema and the version are required. Okay, things like parameters are optional, but in most cases you will find them. Parameters will make a JSON file much more flexible. So for example, admin username, right? By having it as a parameter, when I go to execute this to bring this into Azure, I can provide a parameter file that has the values for these parameters. In this case, I've got the admin username, we got admin password, the DNS label prefix, which is very common, right? Windows OS version, and here's, now some of these will have a default value. So if I don't provide the Windows OS version as a parameter, it will use the 2016 data center, okay? But I could use any of these, okay? So this is just restricting um, what's available here, okay? Certificates to be shared in what? Like, we deal with certificates here pretty much the same you would in an on-prem environment. You can have deploy a certificate, a specific certificate, to multiple machines if you wish. Okay. And then we go down, so metadata. Here's the VM size. And there's again, we have a default value. Okay. So whatever the size of the virtual machine is, the location, again. Now that what this is doing is it's looking at the resource group, because when you create a resource group, you create it in a particular region as well. So what it's saying here is, well, you want to create a virtual machine. You probably want it in the same region that the resource group is in. But notice that it's a default value. Okay, there's no technical requirement for me to create a virtual machine in the same region as the resource group. Most often it is, but I don't have to do that. So if my resource group is in East US, I could create a virtual machine, say in Europe, doesn't matter, right? But it will default to the location of the resource group. Then we have variables, and again, the variables, this is also optional. This simply makes things a little bit easier to read. So you can have storage account name instead of some, gobbledygooky name or something like that. We can have, the name of the NIC and the address, etc. Then we get into the resources part. So the first one, we have a storage account. So it's going to take the variable storage account name and create it in the whatever the location is. Let's say East US, and it'll be a standard locally redundant storage. This is the base one, and the storage, whatever you store in there, there's 3 copies of it. It just looks after it. Okay. Then, it just walks through the various types of resources that are created. So here's a virtual network, for example. Here's a network interface that you're creating, etc. Okay. And this is the Microsoft site, right? docs.microsoft.com. So it can get, generally when we get into this stuff, you want to start with a relatively simple JSON file and then build on it, okay? We also have things called quick start templates. Now, quick start templates these are actually kind of neat. Here's an example. You can find them on GitHub or on the Microsoft site, right? And you'll notice here, there are 907 of them right now. And this number changes. The last time I was in here, it was like 875 or something like that. People just add them. And basically what these are, with a JSON file is just a text file. You can create a JSON file in Notepad, for example. You probably wouldn't, but you could. What people do is they will create a JSON file to do something. And when they're finished, they will submit that JSON file to Microsoft. Microsoft will then vet the thing, make sure that it does what it's supposed to do, and so on. And then they make it available here. So for example, if you're just learning about, okay, how do I deploy a Windows VM? Here's a simple one. I don't want to get into anything, like if I'm just starting with this, I don't want to get into really complicated where you have multiple machines and SQL boxes and domain controllers and so on and so forth. I want to start simple. All of that is possible, but I want to start simple. So here, somebody by the name of Brian Moore, submitted this one. So this is just create a simple VM. Here, so create a new resource group, and you'd have to specify the name. Okay, and we have the resource group deployment. Okay, and notice that it's pulling from GitHub. Okay, so and this is PowerShell, and then this is the command line. Okay. The other nice thing about these things, like I could browse it on GitHub as well if I want to see the actual code that's associated with it, etc. So here's the Azure deployed JSON. There's the actual JSON file behind it. You can see the schema and the content, and it's got some parameters in it. But it's a relatively simple one. All it is deploying a virtual machine. Now you might look at this and say, well, yeah, okay, fine, this is nice, but now what? How am I supposed to get this thing out of off the Microsoft site or out of GitHub and get it into Azure? Well, the simple thing is they put a button here. So I can just click this and it'll take me into Azure, into the portal. Oh, but I've got the wrong set of credentials here, unfortunately. So this one's not working. But it takes me directly into the portal and allows me, and we can do the deployment directly from there. Okay, so that's a sampling of some of the features, some of the services that are available in Azure, and how we can deploy them. And you will find as you go through Azure that, as I mentioned, there's a fairly common look and feel as you, especially in the portal, when you're trying to create the various resources. But what it allows you to do, so for example, here, this is my home one. This just shows the resources that I've recently done something with, and it does give me shortcuts up here for the various services. So I had earlier I did the example of virtual machine, so I can just click here. But if what I want is not on here, I can go. There is the sidebar here, right, that gives me most of the things that are available. I can also go into the various services, right? So this one's just an overview. It just gives you a shortcut. But if I wanted to see all of them, okay, as I mentioned, there's a very large number of resources available within Azure, right? So even like within web, I mentioned the app services. That's probably the most common one. Okay, so these are your applications that you can create and so on. App service plans allow you to create an environment in which an application is run. So if I need, like, because these are PaaS resources, I don't have access to an underlying virtual machine or operating system or anything like that. What the app service plan does is allows me to describe to Azure, by the way, this is the level of resources that I need allocated to me for my systems. Okay, but you can get into things. You got the API services, you got the content delivery network. This is used quite a bit. But you can see there's a large number, and the databases. I just mentioned the SQL one, but you can see we have Cosmos. You've got MySQL. You've got you know um, all kinds of different, and of course the Azure SQL, for example, is the PaaS version of SQL Server, right? So I can deploy one of those as well. Get into analytics. This is where you get into your big data. So the HD insights. This is if you do anything with Hadoop, you would get into the HD insights. We do have Databricks, which is a facility in Azure that allows you to pull data together from you know, a bunch of different sources, and then we have data factories that allows you to take the data as it's coming from all of those different sources. Maybe I need to I don't know, push it into a data warehouse. Well, a data warehouse, any database system, relational database system, including data warehouses, are very specific as to the type of the format of data they will accept. So we can use a data factory to accept data from any one of a number of sources, convert it into tabular data or something along those lines, and then push it into a database or a data warehouse. Okay. This is some of the machine learning I was talking about. I mentioned the bot services, but there's cognitive services. There's you know, the machine learning. There's languages are built into it as well. And then the Internet of Things, this part is has exploded over the last number of years. There's a lot of stuff within the Internet of Things area, and we can have an IoT hub which accepts the data coming in from the IoT devices themselves, and then direct them to wherever it is that I need them to go to. But you can see there are a lot of different services here as well. There's the integration. Logic apps are actually an interesting area. Um, they're applications, but they're not written in like a third generation language like C or Python or something along those lines. You can do that by using, you can use those language using Azure functions. But for many people, like for developers, sure, absolutely, go to C Sharp or Python or something like that to write your functions. But a lot of people don't like that. They're not really into that kind of coding. So logic apps come in really handy because it's more of a shape driven thing where you have individual shapes and objects to represent different pieces of data, and then you bring it to, you just slide them and bring them onto your development development slide and go from there. Let's see, we have identity, but all kinds of them built in. Okay, so do we have any questions?
Thank you, Bert, for that presentation. It was very informative. And so it also shows just the flexibility that you have with the services. I don't see any questions in our Q&A panel here, but I'm going to pause for a moment just as people catch up to see if anyone wants to type in any of the questions that they've had from the presentation. While I give you that time, I'm just going to give you a few friendly reminders here. So this session was recorded, and we will be sharing the recording to the email you registered with. The PowerPoint is not shared separately. I saw that question just come in, but it is in the recording that you can watch. That recording is available to you for up to a year, and we have upcoming webinars as well on our Global Knowledge website that you can share. So we just got one question in for Bert. If I create a resource via the portal, can I export the JSON as a template?
Absolutely. Yeah, not a problem. Once it's deployed, I didn't deploy one here, but once the resource is deployed, you can certainly go in and either simply view, if that's all you want, or you can save the JSON. And as a matter of fact, a lot of people will do that. So for example, the ones that I showed here, you can see it can get complicated fairly quickly. Well, one way around that is to start with something that's already deployed and export the JSON from there, and then use that as your starting point.
Great. So now we do have another question here. What data source types Power BI can connect or get information from data gathering and analytics? I apologize, I stumbled through that question a little bit.
Not a problem. That's a really loaded one. When you're talking about Azure and you're talking, like, I know you're referring specifically to Power BI here, but anytime that you're talking about any of the data related stuff, the data bricks that I was talking about a few moments ago, or the data factory and so on, almost anything. And as a matter of fact, when you start looking at, like with Logic Apps, for example, you have built-in connectors that allow you to connect to different data sources. But if you need to connect to a data source for which there is currently no built-in connector, that's not a problem. You have the ability to create your own, right? So it's almost, the world is your oyster, so to speak. You can pull data from almost anything.
Thank you, Bert. Another question has popped in here. If we create virtual machine of Azure Active Directory and store any data in cloud, is there any services way to save locally and on the cloud?
Locally and on the cloud, like separately or synchronized? I mean, it depends on what you have set up. You can have a hybrid environment. So for example, I could be sitting here in my office. I've got my own Active Directory set up. I have my own network. I also have Azure. I have networks in Azure and so on. I can create a VPN connection between the two, or if you have ExpressRoute, whichever. And then the Azure network becomes, for all intents and purposes, part of my local network in exactly the same way if I had just opened another office somewhere else in so like in another city or something like that. Well, because I do that, or I can do that, I do have the ability, if I do have like a share, for example, that's on premises, right? And I have a virtual machine running in Azure. Well, I can map that share to the Azure virtual machine. And then in that case, sure, from the end user, whoever's using that machine, they can't tell the difference. It's just mapped to the local stuff. We do also have, if we're not without the virtual machine, I mean, there's all kinds of synchronization facilities available as well in Azure, where I can specify, and this is not including a virtual machine, but if I've got some folders here in my office and I need to protect those, right? So disaster recovery kind of stuff. I can use some of the Azure file replication services to pick up those folders and synchronize them in the cloud. That way, if anything happens in my office, I still have them. But that's sort of a side issue from your question, because it doesn't include a virtual machine.
Great answer. So the next question is, if I can describe the data logically, is there a way to see recommendations? For example, data stores?
I'm not 100% sure what you're asking here. Like, I can create within a database, for example, like I can create tables, etc., and describe the data. Well, I mean, you have to specify, within a relational database what the table is, what the individual columns are, etc. But I'm not sure describing the data locally or logically. Sorry, what you're referring to there.
Perfect. If the attendee who submitted that question wants to provide any other clarification, then please feel free to submit it and I'll read that one aloud. I'm just going to go in order here.
Okay.
So the next question is, are the data centers in the US and Europe, and can you choose which one?
There's data centers on every continent on the planet except Antarctica. So yes, there are a bunch of data centers in Europe. There's United States. There's like Africa, Asia. There's some in Australia, wherever, and you choose where you want them, right? You remember when I was creating the VM in the portal and I said, it defaulted to East US, but I said I could just, it's just a drop down list and I can select where I want it because, I could have a company that's here in North America, but I may be setting something up because I've got an office, say, in Tokyo. Well, I don't want the folks in Tokyo to have to access a resource that's sitting here in North America. If there's a bunch of them over there, I would probably deploy that resource into one of the regions in Japan to have it closer to them. We always want the resource to be as close to the end user as possible. Which certification is better, doing Azure or AWS? Are you asking about Azure certification versus AWS certification? It's I'm not sure there, but that's Azure versus AWS. Which one's better? That's like Ford or Chev, right? It's um, you're going to get advocates on both sides and so on.
I would agree with that. It definitely is one where it's um, preference, especially with what companies you're targeting and what they use. So it looks like we have it submitted as well. Do you know which countries in Africa have the data centers?
There are two of them in South Africa right now, and I believe that there's one that has been slated for somewhere in North Africa. I'm not sure which country it is. Um, and then there. Last time I saw there was 143 different regions, and there are a number of data centers and regions that are on the drawing board now. There's a couple in the Middle East. There's I think some more in Asia. Uh, Actually, there's a new one in Canada. I've heard. I haven't seen it officially yet, but I heard that in Canada they're supposed to be putting one in Vancouver.
That is awesome. It looks like they're always expanding. I
Oh
want to
yeah.
touch on a question that's been out for a little bit just around, can you touch on services and components which are free, especially storage?
Most of the things that are available, like machine learning, not so much. That tends to be kind of expensive. But most of the things, like virtual machines, for example, there are free ones. Now, you there's no license to deploy to production, but you probably wouldn't even if you could. It's not going to be some real big skookum heavy duty server or anything, but there are enough in there for you to get a feel for like what are these virtual machine things in Azure? How do I deal with them? What do I do? There's also subscriptions that you can get for free. So, and some of them, like there's some for students, there's just a straight free subscription. You get 100, depending on what the subscription is, either 100 or $200, um, you know, Azure dollars that you can use in Azure, and that's for, I believe that's 3 months, and then for the balance of the 12-month period, there's a bunch of resources that you have for free. You can set up some resource groups, you can set up some networking components, you can set up virtual machines, and so on.
I think a follow-up question to that is, what is an Azure dollar?
Oh, well, what's the best way to describe it? When you're in Azure, right? This is a um, costed facility. So you have an account in there that as you consume resources, it sort of ticks up and adds, and at the end of the month you get the bill and so on. Well, the Azure dollars, they don't really exist. It's just that some of them, um, for example, if you're a Microsoft partner, you can get the Action Pack, and the Action Pack gives you $100 a month. That means that in my company, I can go through $100 worth of Azure resources without incurring any direct cost to me, right? So at the beginning of every month, I'm allocated $100 from Microsoft in my Azure account. Now, if I go through $200 worth of resources, I get a bill for $100, right? So, I mean, the Azure dollar, that's just something I use to refer to it.
That's a
Uh,
great answer. It makes a lot of sense. We do have the clarification to the earlier question around being able to logically describe something and trying to get recommendations for data stores. So the clarification says too many data stores to pick from. So there's just too many. There's cost, setup, a lot of things you have to consider based on the requirements. So why set up and pay for a Rolls Royce when you get like a Chevy will do? So is there a way that the service can recommend for based on the requirements?
There are there well, most of the recommendation facilities they have things like migration assistance, for example. So if you have something running on-prem right now and you're looking at migrating that into Azure, the migration assistant will help you in deciding, you know, what way you're going to go and things like that, like what size of machine do you need, and those kinds of decisions. But you know, the question, you know, that question could be the same like in an on-prem environment. If we've got some sort of a solution that we need to develop and deploy to support some aspect of the business, we have to make these technical decisions as to like what am I going to go with? Am I going, you know, even within, I was talking with SQL Server earlier, there's a whole bunch of different versions of SQL Server. The SQL Express is free, right? Enterprise is a very expensive piece of equipment. Well, which one do I go with? Well, it's going to be dependent upon the criteria of the actual application itself. Sometimes I can get away with SQL Express. Other times I can't, right? So there will always be those kinds of decisions. I can't think of a tool in Azure or around Azure that would allow me to plug in and say, yeah, okay, fine, here, this is what I want. You go figure out what it is and make a recommendation. Because you're right, there are a very large number of different possibilities. You know, we could use a SQL database, Cosmos database. You could use just to see Azure Storage itself, because it has a table facility. So if you're just looking at storing unstructured, uh, roughly tabular data, you just store it in Azure Storage in tables, not a problem. Can you store it as files? Right. So there's a whole bunch of uh, different solutions, and it depends on what you need.
That's a great answer. It sounds like something that definitely needs the user to potentially dig in a little bit more.
Absolutely.
So the next question I want to make sure we get to is overall comparing AWS and Azure. In your experience, does Azure have more data centers, services, and options than AWS?
I'm restricted on my experience with AWS. Most of my experience is with Azure. So I don't think it would be fair for me to do a direct comparison.
Yeah, I think that's fair because if you haven't had equal experiences there, it's hard to say. I think we're going to try to get to one more question here, which is what's the difference between IPA and RPA and how much IA does Azure embed into these services?
So this is the are you referring to like the robotic stuff, or which is the IP and the RPA? Oh, okay. There's this stuff is evolving constantly. There's a huge amount. Just to give you a really quick example of some of the stuff that they do. This isn't specifically robotics, but it's part of all the machine learning. There was a lady, actually, I believe this video is still available on YouTube. There's a lady, I don't recall her name, unfortunately, sorry, but she's a VP with Microsoft, and she needed to do a presentation in Tokyo. Now, obviously, the folks in Tokyo, most of them are Japanese. They speak Japanese. She does not. She speaks English. Using the built-in Microsoft facilities, both in Azure and other facilities, like the HoloLens, for example, which is a technology Microsoft has to do the holograms. She was able to do her presentation standing on a stage in Redmond and have that projected to a stage in Tokyo, right? So it looked like her, with same clothes, same hair color, and all that good stuff. It also did, part of the machine learning in Azure did real-time translation. And not only did it change, like it wasn't, you know how sometimes you get those answering machine things that you get that real mechanical voice. That's not what it was like. It sounded like her speaking Japanese, right? So those kinds of facilities are available today in Azure, right? And there's been a lot of work that's being done in a lot of the machine learning stuff. You know, it's simple things like, you know, a pizza joint. Somebody wants to order a pizza. You can connect to, they can have a bot that's running in Azure that will interact with the client and apply intelligence to the individual sentences, either spoken, right? Or you can do it as sort of like text message kind of things, and it will just interpret what is the user trying to say, what are they asking for, and come up with intelligent offerings, right? So, and like I say, all of that stuff is built into Azure now.
That is awesome. We are at the top of the hour here, so I just want to finish up with a few housekeeping items. I know there are a few more questions that we didn't get to answer, so I apologize for not getting there, but you can always learn more in our classes as well. And so, Bert, if you want to go to the next slide.
Oops, sorry. I could just say that VMware to Hyper-V, that's all included in the migration tools.
Glad we got one more question in. That's always beneficial. So we want to thank Bert for teaching us and showing us all of his expertise here. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, we recommend the courses that you see here on your screen. And then as an attendee of today's webinar, we are saying that it's easy to make your next step. So there are discount codes, if we go to the next slide here, for the United States and Canada. So these will allow you to receive 25% off your next Global Knowledge course. So use webinar 25 in the US and CA webinar 25 in Canada. And finally, I just want to be sure that you continue to visit the Global Knowledge website to access additional free resources like technical articles, white papers, I apologize, did not speak that clearly, and webinars. So everyone have a wonderful day, and we thank you for joining our webinar.
Thank you, Courtney.
Thank you, Bert.